Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Alberta Freemason podcast. I'm Preston Meyer, Secretary and Past Master of Acacia Lodge 11 in Edmonton, and the editor of this production.
Hi, my name's John Hayes. I'm immediate past master of Highlands Unity Lodge and a past Grand Master or Sovereign Grand Master of the Allied Masonic Degrees of Canada.
Bill Brook, past DDGM of the Athabasca District and Secretary of Fort McMurray Lodge 195.
Chris Uchman, past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Alberta, past many other things. But for today, the more important role is the chairman of fraternal relations for the Grand Lodge of Alberta.
Awesome. And thanks for joining us today.
This should be an interesting topic. There's a
I
lot
think so.
of misunderstandings around all the different terms and
Yeah.
realities and
Yeah.
you know I got a fairly good knowledge. I'm not going to say I'm the expert because I don't think anybody in the world is.
But you know enough to be a valuable guest for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and I've been moderator on online stuff for 20 years, so I've seen the people come in and go, "Oh, he's a clandy, he doesn't count, and he's not a real Mason," and blah 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 blah. And you know,
Yeah, see, yeah, and that's where the some of the terminology is important because there's a difference between irregular, clandestine, unrecognized, recognized, regular.
I mean, do we even use word like clandestine in the Grand Lodge of Alberta Constitution?
No,
I didn't think so.
no,
I don't
it's
remember it being
regularity. Our
regularity.
concern is regularity,
Yeah,
and that's
which is
like
essentially just recognition, isn't it?
no, no. So regularity grants the basis for recognition.
Mhm. Yeah,
Is a good way of explaining it. Like a lot. That's where I was saying there's a lot of people misunderstand certain little nuances of it. Like first, to meet the standards of regularity, which you've got the two different. You've got the United Grand Lodge of England's kind of list of what makes you regular, and then you've got the Conference of Grand Masters of North America, like the Commission for Information on Regularity.
yeah,
And those two, they're similar, but of course they don't always match up. Like UGLE recognizes a number of Grand Lodges or considers them to be regular and recognizes them, ones that most North Americans don't.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they even put out a statement about the feminine Grand Lodges and said they are regular except for the one point, which is they admit women to Masonry. And so they recognize their regularity in practice. They just don't recognize their regularity in who they admit.
So that see, and I actually had a very great privilege last year. I was at the annual communication for Grand Lodge of California, and the Pro Grand Master was there, and he from United Grand Lodge of England, and he actually talked about it. He says because he says our brethren's heads across the pond are all exploding over our statements, and so their statement is basically that they are a legitimate Masonic organization. So they are regular, even to down to the point because they follow the same constitution. Like when they adopted the same constitution when they originally were founded, the Women's Freemason. They were a co-Freemasonry, and then I think it was in 1920 is when they stopped admitting men.
Yeah, and then they just let the men attrition leave by attrition essentially.
Correct.
Yeah.
So the United Grand Lodge of England's position is because they follow all the landmarks other than only men can be admitted. There's a one that only men can be admitted, but they look at it and say, but it's a single sex organization, so it really they are a legitimate Masonic organization, and they support each other, and they issue joint statements, they do joint things. But they will not sit in lodge together, and neither of them want to.
And I think it's really interesting that neither of them recognize co-masonry because it it includes the mingling of the sexes
Yes,
in lodge.
yeah, and the both the women's and United Grand Lodge of England, they support that concept of single sex masonry for the fact that it's good for the individual to be able to do things in a closed organization. Now, the benefit of UGLE recognizing the women's masonry too is that it eliminates any concern of them coming and saying, oh, you can't be doing this, because they act in the exact same manner.
Yeah.
But that's where that kind of that regularity, you start building the foundation towards recognition. Because there's many there, especially newer Grand Lodges, right? There's lots of Grand Lodges that may meet the requirements of regularity, but they're not recognized yet. Because a lot of times, for example, most Grand Lodges, established, Grand Lodges, they'll wait, upwards some 5, some 10 years before they do the formal recognition. They'll say, yes, you meet the standards of regularity, but there's that one thing where you've got the legitimacy of origin and the supremacy of territory. So, like, if you look at the North American standards, it's legitimacy of origin, the supremacy of territory, or a treaty of mutual territory. And that's where you're seeing a lot of the state and Prince Hall Grand Lodges sign these treaties, but it really goes into effect as more down in Mexico, where you've got a national Grand Lodge and you've got all the state Grand Lodges. And then you've got the final is that the volume of the sacred law must be permanent furniture within the lodge, which, that's a reference to Continental Freemasonry, where they removed it and that schism happened.
Yeah.
You know.
The more interesting one for me is, like, all that makes perfect sense. In many ways, the most interesting one for me is the fact that we can recognize an organization like Swedish Freemasonry, which
It's
is
pretty different.
really quite a lot outside the Overton window from all the rest of the Grand Lodges. And, it doesn't seem to be regular in several ways. For one thing, it only admit it's a Christian organization, and Freemasonry elsewhere is in sometimes de facto Christian, but seldom in print Christian.
But the singularity of a religion is not, nor is the plurality of religion one of the landmarks of Masonry. So when you look at, if you look at, I was saying the North American standards, they're more, like it should be established by, it's got to have that legitimacy of origin, which means it was established by a recognized, legitimate, regular Grand Lodge. But then you start going through the Grand Lodge of England, which is from like around 1929, and they start going through a bunch more stuff. And it kind of goes back to that Premier Grand Lodge and all these things. But the one thing nowhere in there does it state the plurality of religion. But it does state that the volume of sacred law or a holy book must be permanent furniture within the lodge. So saying it's only Christian, because we have within the York Rites, different organizations that are strictly Christian. But I agree with you. It kind of it goes against the I would say the nuance of Masonry. That it's about the great architect. It's about the belief in something greater, not necessarily a specific God, but something greater than we are.
Yeah, it tends to cross the ethos of what we have here. I think it's the feel and and admittedly I've never been in lodge in Sweden, so it's I'm talking from a completely uninformed point of view in the sense of experiencing it, but it doesn't feel like it would be the same kind of thing in many ways, but perhaps it would. And of course, as I said, a lot of American lodges are in many ways de facto Christian anyway, because there seems to be and I shouldn't pick on American lodges probably. A lot of Grand Lodges are kind of de facto Christian anyway, because the default religion is Christianity, and at some level, no one else is unwelcome but allowed in, or something like that. There's a kind of a
Yeah.
nuance there, and it's a kind of interesting one to see. And of course, again, that I've seen that from a distance as well, although I've seen it a little bit closer because I visited a couple of lodges in the U.S. that were kind of, what kind of Christian are you, rather than, what religion are you, which is, or what faith, or here we don't even ask. You just say it at the first time at the door, and then after that, it's a given.
Well, and if you think about it, though, Masonry really has evolved from a Judeo-Christian organization into what it is. It was, the foundation of Masonry. When you look at our rituals, is Judeo-Christian. You know, and
Well, the commission, the rule about peace and harmony between faiths was mostly the whole Catholic Protestant division
yes,
at the beginning.
Or even between different Protestant groups. So, the Calvinists versus the Presbyterians versus the Baptists versus the Anglicans. That if they can all get along, well, the Catholics are just no issue at all, kind of thing. So,
which is, it's interesting when we start that gets into that irregular versus regulars, like continental masonry according to our standards, like the Grand Lodge of Alberta's recognized standards, which are the Conference of Grand Masters. We remember that. I actually, for the last number of years, go to the commission each year at the conference. I find it quite interesting and fascinating, and it helps me do my job as the chairman of fraternal relations when we're doing, because they do a lot of the investigation. Now the thing is they don't make a statement about recognition, just regularity, and it's up to each individual Grand Lodge to choose. Because that's the thing too, is when you start talk about recognition, is it's each Grand Lodge has its individual ability to recognize any Grand Lodge. Now, there could be consequences for such recognition. That you may all of a sudden find yourself no longer being in the greatest of amity or have bilateral relationships with other ones due to a choice, but we're free to make those choices.
well, that happened in Minnesota 25 years ago when they recognized the Grand Orient of France, um, without, and the Grand Orient did not have the volume of the Sacred Law
Yeah.
as a landmark, and they recognized them, and they were immediately de-recognized by a few dozen, well, or at least threatened with de-recognition.
Yes.
I don't remember if they actually went through it, or if the Grand Lodge of Minnesota kind of pulled back and said, "Whoa, okay, we get
Normally,
it."
that's what happens, is because and it normally comes from United Grand Lodge of England first. They carry a big stick, and even if it is just that, like, the fear of being de-recognized by them, but you'll even see where you get schisms between other Grand Lodges, and they start threatening to pull recognition, and it's a dangerous road, because we're supposed to rely on brotherly love, not threats.
Yeah.
But there are times, and that's where that irregular Grand Lodges can come into play. So, like, there's unrecognized. So, an unrecognized Grand Lodge is a regular Grand Lodge. It's just not been recognized, at least in the terminology that I think of. But then an irregular one is one of two things. It could have at one time been a regular recognized Grand Lodge, and they've done something to lose that recognition. Similar, as we were saying, we keep bringing up Continental Freemasonry, where they decided that they would remove the volume of the sacred law, and I can't remember the words they used, but they changed the wording to basically say, like, the conscience of society or something like that. And that's what created them becoming irregular in the minds of the established Grand Lodges throughout the world. And when I say that, that was mainly, of course, United Grand Lodge of England and its offshoots, and then North American Masonry. And when you talk about Masonry as a whole, on a per capita basis, the most Masons in the world are in North America and England, like Great Britain. Even though you've got, like, throughout South America, it's growing throughout, most of the Spanish-speaking world, but it's still not nearly as large as it is. Even with the decline, we still have a massive amount of Masons. But, you also get those, so they can do that, or you can have the situation like Valle de Mexico. So I don't know how familiar you are with them, but there's two, for lack of a better term, national Grand Lodges in Mexico. One is York Grand Lodge in Mexico, which is came out of Veracruz, Mexico. Into Veracruz, but from Cuba. And then you've got Valle, which is like the Valley of Mexico, so it's Scottish Rite Freemasonry. So it came out of the Caribbean and out of Louisiana. And so they had claim basically over the territories within Mexico. And as each of these territories became states, they went and they would cede the territory, and these state Grand Lodges formed, which were Scottish Rite Grand Lodges. And it's only been recently, and when I say recently, some in the States, it's in the last 40, 50 years, but here even more recently, where we've started recognizing those Grand Lodges, the state Grand Lodges, first because that's when York and them started signing these treaties. But Valle, they started wanting them back. And it's quite interesting that they're considered a predatory Grand Lodge right now. And they started opening up, like, not respecting territorial supremacy, even going into Texas and trying to open up lodges. And that's where you start getting into that clandestine Grand Lodges and the relationship with Valle de Mexico. And so, again, irregular means you at one time were regular, or you've got just one thing off. So it means that for the most part you follow all the landmarks, the ancient landmarks, the standards of regularity, except for maybe one or two small things. Clandestine is you've never had legitimate origin. That's where people miss the fact that Prince Hall has never ever been clandestine Grand Lodges. Now there are clandestine Prince Hall Grand Lodges, but the original Prince Hall or Prince Hall affiliated never has been clandestine. They have legitimacy of origin through the United Grand Lodge of England. And it's even recognized, and it was one of the first places to be recognized, is through them. So they were considered irregular because or didn't meet the regularity in most of the state Grand Lodges or in the United States and Canada, because they said, well, you don't have supremacy. You can only be one Grand Lodge. And we had that for way too long, even here in Alberta, where that was the argument. There can only be one. But
That
then
got
you sort of think,
complicated with Newfoundland.
Yeah.
oh yeah,
Well,
but and again, that there are places, even in the Philippines, when the United or Grand Lodge of the Philippines was formed, there was 3 or 4 different other competing Grand Lodges trying to form around that time, and it was basically the American Grand Lodge that won out. Because
I think Quebec for a long time had competing Grand Lodges as well. They had st lodges that maintained affinity to the UGLE or Scotland
yeah,
in Quebec while the Grand Lodge was operating. I think that's done with now, but Newfoundland maintains it with the Scottish lodges.
yes, yeah. There's and what was it? At one time, there's 3 Grand Lodges operating in Newfoundland. 2 of them kind of came together because you've had the provincial. Well, there's the Grand Lodge of Scotland that's there, the provincial Grand Lodge. I think there's a provincial Grand Lodge of UGLE.
Was it UGLE or was it Ireland?
That's what it was. Sorry, Ireland.
I think it was
Those
Ireland, yeah.
and UGLE and UGLE and Ireland, I believe, were the ones that merged together in the 90s to create the Grand Lodge of Newfoundland.
Yeah.
And that all that dates back to them pre-joining even Canada.
Well, and I think one of the other cool things, or interesting things, not maybe cool, is that some of the major divisions in Freemasonry globally are based not on disagreeing with the landmarks, but on reading them differently. So, like Clipsas in Europe says, we agree with the first landmark. We just don't think it says what the mainstream lodges say it says. And we think it says, if you want to have a volume of sacred law, you can. But we leave it up to the lodges. And that's not how the mainstream lodges read that landmark. And so they disagree on the reading, not that the landmark is legitimate. And of course, that's Belgium and France, and
Yeah.
about 50, nearly 50 Grand Lodges now are under that organization or affiliated with it.
Well, and that's where it gets complicated in Italy,
Oh,
because UGLE recognizes the one uh, Grand Lodge, and most of the North American Grand Lodges recognize the others, and then UGLE made a statement that they recognize the wrong one, and it's just, but they're not going to unrecognize them. Like it's very confusing, and that's one of the. I guess I find it fascinating, interesting, the history of Masonry, because Masonry is not this clean, smooth, direct line. Whether you look in Canada, North America, or just around the world, Masonry, because there's still that compete the prestige and power and social strength of Masonry. So, and you're really seeing it right now in a lot of the former Soviet bloc countries, that there's quite a competition for who gets to be the legitimate one. And that's what I was saying, at the commission every year, like we'll get guys from Bulgaria, from like there's United Grand Lodge of Georgia, the country, and then the Grand Lodge of Georgia, the country, and which is the legitimate one. So they keep, every year the United guys keep coming back and saying, no, it's us. Because of this happened, and ironically, every time they do it, they prove themselves to be wrong by their own information, because what was done was irregular. It was done in an irregular fashion. So, and then you've got like a lot of influence by the Grand Lodge of Russia. And unfortunately, and this is my opinion only, this is not the stance of the Grand Lodge of Alberta. This is my personal one through just the amount of experience I've had dealing with things. You've got the Grand Lodge of Russia is a political organization. It starts opening up, in Chechnya and in Kazakhstan and Georgia, where they're going into the areas as Russia goes in. They've done it in Ukraine too. In Ukraine, where they start opening up or taking and absorbing these lodges into the Grand Lodge of Russia, and saying, "Oh no, they wanted to be. They requested it." So, on a personal level, I have great issues with it, but we've not made a ruling, and that's why I've stated it the way I did. It's like Valle de Mexico, where we've suspended our recognition of them due to their predatory nature, while they've, numerous other ones have, and now they're going in front of the commission again this year to plead their case, and I think to say that they've reformed themselves and they're good people again. Yeah, and this will be
I
the
know
third time they've done it.
I know that there was a lot of back and forth a few years ago about Grand Lodges in Brazil as well. So the various states there,
Yeah.
and a number of again competing Grand Lodges, competing to be regular and competing to be recognized. And I think from a an outsider perspective, and none of us are outsiders, um, this can't matter much, right? If you're Bob and you're in Des Moines, Iowa, and somebody says, "Hey, I'm a Mason," and you say, "Hey, I've always wanted to be one. I could join." You don't know if you're joining an irregular, unrecognized lodge, a clandestine lodge, or the regular lodge. You have no idea. And if the practices are more or less the same, in other words, if all other things were equal, you'd probably recognize the lodge. Then, in a lot of ways, it's a completely meaningless distinction to the guy on the streets, the 27-year-old man in Des Moines, Iowa, saying, "Hey, I'd love to be a Mason." It's a weird kind of distinction, and to have him join and maybe pay $500 to join and go through all the degrees, and then have, you know, Jeff from California say online, "Well, you're not a real Mason. We don't recognize you," is really odd, and calls into question a lot of the processes that we talk about, and it calls into question, I think, a little bit our idea of brotherhood, the idea that, did I say Bob? Bob in Des Moines joins completely good-heartedly and finds out 6 years and $3,000 later that none of these other people think he's legit, even though he's done all the same stuff, except he joined one without that little rubber stamp on the Grand Lodge kind of
As you
paper.
said, $3,000 later. So he's joined a Grand Lodge. It's primarily about extracting money, and that's what happens. That's
Yes.
the type. But they still have they have the same rituals. They have the same initiatory practices. They do all this. So now for any of us to then have the arrogance to say you're not a real Mason, I question that. And I question a lot of times whenever anybody has that black and white view of anything, especially within Masonry. As you learn, and the journey of Masonry is supposed to be a journey of enlightenment and growing. Now there are people that they will end up in that. So the problem, you realize the organization you're in is not recognized pretty much anywhere in the world. Now there are ways that we can assist. Like, yes, most of the time it means going through the degrees again in a recognized one. And it's easy. A cousin of Lanny's, of course, he's from the Philippines, and Masonry in the Philippines holds a great deal of status, whether that's right or wrong, but it does. And a lot of young men want to become Masons, and it's very difficult to become a Mason there. You have to, and in a lot of ways, rightfully so, because one of the things within Masonry is, the financial burden of being a Mason should never affect your family. Well, there to be a Mason, you've got to have an above average income due to the low incomes there. So those are some of the rationale. But he was working abroad in Macau, and he was approached by a group saying, "Hey, you want to join our lodge?" And he got very excited, but he was smart. He reached out to me, and the Lodge of the Rising Sun from the Independent Grand Lodge of Portugal.
To us, that probably sounds sketchy. To him, it might have sounded impressive. Who knows?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah,
because it's and so I checked into it, and no, it's not. It's definitely not a recognized or legitimate Grand Lodge or lodge, and I said to him, I said, start asking more questions, because if your hope is to one day go to lodge with me, joining that lodge is not your path.
yeah,
And for the not, I wouldn't say uneducated, but brethren that just may not have the same depth of knowledge about all this kind of complicated side of Masonry, is to always remember that it's knowingly. The term is knowingly attending irregular, clandestine, or unrecognized lodge is the Masonic offense, not attending it. So if anybody is traveling and ends up at a lodge, and then all of a sudden finds out after the fact that they maybe shouldn't have been there, calm down, chalk it up as an experience, just don't do it again.
yeah.
Like, don't go back, because it's not an offense if you unknowingly do it.
We had a guy in our lodge. We have a guy in our lodge, and he joined the Prince Hall Lodge in Edmonton, unrecognized at the time,
Yeah.
and he switched over to mainstream masonry in the 80s, I think, or early 90s. But he went through the degrees again in our lodge. But he has some interesting stories to tell about that. He says um, they're still some of his best friends,
Okay.
and several of them and their kids have come over and become involved in mainstream masonry. Um, and so that was kind of interesting. But he said it was he joined it because he was involved in a sport, and they were a number of them were involved there, and they said, "Hey, you'd be a good guy," and he goes, "That sounds fun," and joined, and didn't realize what was going on. He said 6 or 7 years later, he said, I want to visit this lodge. And they said, well, you kind of can't. And he said, well, why? And uh, came around. And so he said, well, why don't we just, all kind of go over there? And some of them did, and some of them didn't. So we ended up with one of our longtime past masters and officers that way.
Yeah. Well, and that's, you see more and more, especially down in certain parts of the States, New York, California, where the Prince Hall Grand Lodge and the State Grand Lodge work hand in hand in a lot of initiatives. Yet they want to stay separate and distinct for historical and personal reasons. Yet they can sit in lodge together now, they can do things, and I think that's a great thing. They have their own unique history as a Grand Lodge, and of course, my little plug for March is we've got an amazing opportunity coming up to really hear some of those histories and everything directly from individuals that know them personally. So I remember that this whole started, the way these two individuals are coming up was, I met them at a couple different events, but we were sitting there talking one time. I said, it'd be so nice to actually get education about Prince Hall from Prince Hall Masons. Because I said, growing up in Alberta, I said, I've heard lots of education from non-Prince Hall guys about Prince Hall Masonry. And then, they laugh saying the same things happen to them. that they've had a lot of education over the years about regular state Grand Lodges from Prince Hall Masons, and once you start going off and looking, it's from a different perspective and it's not always correct. And Prince Hall Masonry's got just as long a history as 95% of the Grand Lodges in North America. And to say they're not real Masons is an affront to Masonry and the principles of it.
We've talked about this, but then it kind of falls back on the secretaries or whatever to figure out, is the person coming into the lodge, is he regular, is he irregular? I know we have the Amity app that we can always go into. I don't know if all of the lodges that are in that app are actually recognized by the Grand Lodge of Alberta. There might be a few that aren't. But Chris, with you on the fraternal relations, and you guys, like, you are recognizing several lodges throughout your year. Is there a list that we can reference from Grand Lodge of Alberta to say, here's all the regular lodges that?
So as of right now, I'm the one. I have access to the Amity portal, where the Grand Lodge portal, and I go in as we do recognitions or remove them, and I update it. So now it's interesting because but it's also incumbent on the other Grand Lodge to update it too, because there's Grand Lodges in there that has requested recognition from us. Then we've gone through the process, we've recognized them, yet they haven't done their little click. So the Amity, it's a great 95%er, but it's not perfect because there's, even within the membership, until we get a proper database that can just upload it, we don't know for sure, even with our own members, who's still in good standing. But as far as the lodges, pretty much if it's in there and it says that we have bilateral relations with them, it's correct, because I've gone through over the last 5 years multiple times, and each time we make a change, I go in and update it because I want it to be as up to date as possible.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Alberta Freemason, with voices from across Alberta and music from the Very Worshipful Grand Organist, Brother Emilio De Mercato. Happy to meet, sorry to part. Happy to meet again.